Hello friends. Welcome to the Eastern Front channel. Today we will talk with you about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus Adjutant, Arno von Lenski, who fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. A depressed atmosphere back home. I had had no leave for 2 years. After an examination by the Army's internist, our medical Dr. General, Professor Dr. Haubenreifer, I finally applied for my overdue leave. Despite the tense situation, my application was approved by Paulus. I could leave everything to my deputy, who was informed on all matters. I wanted to go before Easter. Paulus had been permitted by the commander of the army group to attend the baptism of his twin's grandson in Berlin. We traveled back home together. We went by Field Marshal von Bock's special train from Poltava to Kiev, taking Paulus's personal car on an open goods wagon. Paulus wanted to drive from Kiev to Berlin in his car. One of our vehicle maintenance companies in Kiev had orders to put a vehicle at our disposal as far as the Reich border. Accompanying me was a young orderly officer from our staff. Shortly after our arrival in Kiev, we set off on our journey. All seemed set fair for the trip, but that evening a strong snowstorm began and we could hardly see the road. We decided to overnight in Zhytomyr and continue in daylight. But this time I was plagued with bad luck. While tanking up, the vehicle slipped into a pit and the exhaust pipe snapped off right next to the engine. I drove it to the workshop next morning. I had to use all my powers of persuasion to get the damage repaired straight away. It was almost midday when we set off again. We had tanked up and the reserve fuel tank was full. That must have been our lucky break. The vehicle ran well. The snowstorm had abated. In spirit, I saw myself in Kharkov already, where the planned leave train would take me on to Frankfurt am Main. In a cheerful leave atmosphere, I chatted with the driver, a young soldier and auto mechanic by trade. "Have you been a soldier for long?" I asked him. "Since the beginning of the war, Colonel." "How long have you been with the vehicle maintenance company?" "After my training I was posted to the company as a mechanic, took part in the Western campaign and then came here." "How do you find Kiev?" "Yesterday afternoon I only saw a little of the city, but I got a good impression of it." "Yes, Colonel, Kiev is a fine city. We have good accommodation and a proper repair shop. If only it was not so insecure." "What do you mean by that?" "It is not advisable to go out alone in the evenings. Since we have been here there have already been a whole number of soldiers and officers that have vanished without trace. Not from our unit. We were taught and warned right from the beginning. If we go to the cinema or soldiers' home in the evening, there is always a big gang of us and we take our weapons along with us." No, it can't be so bad." "Colonel, I am not exaggerating. There must be partisans organizing the attacks even in the city. We would rather be in a smaller place in which one knows all the civilians. It would be even better if the war ended soon." "You have a longing for the West?" "It was better in every respect there. It was a fine time for us." "And now you are fed up with the war?" "Quite frankly, yes, Colonel. You should hear how our old hands complain. According to the accounts from those on leave, many German soldiers must have bitten the dust in front of Moscow. My friend brought a newspaper of a small country town from. Whole pages were filled with death notices. We drove over a freshly graveled road. Stones as big as one's fist hit the underside of the vehicle. The driver slowed down. We resumed speed after several hundred meters. As we were approaching Rovna, the officer sitting behind me tapped me on the shoulder. "Colonel, I think there is something wrong with the vehicle. We are leaving a trail. Either the tank or the radiator is leaking." We stopped. A stone had made a small hole in the tank. Petrol was leaking out of it. By topping up from the spare tank we were able to reach a petrol station in Rovna. There was no workshop available. The driver blocked the hole with oakum and refilled the tank. We reached Przemysl with the last drops of petrol and drove on to an army workshop. The duty mechanic said that the repair would take at least 2 days, so I decided to continue my journey by train next morning. The following day I was in Frankfurt am Main, the journey having gone without incident. Several hours later I took my wife from the station in Munzenberg to a small town near Bad Nauheim. The next morning I sought out an old acquaintance, the Master Joiner Hartmann, who was especially well informed on politics and history. I sat next to him in his small workshop. Without interrupting his work, he conversed with me for hours. We talked about the war. The mood of the inhabitants of our small town is divided. Those who have relatives in the west and in the northern countries are, as before, on to a good thing. They can hardly understand how these soldiers can send them food, materials, underwear, clothing. Now women, who under normal circumstances can hardly afford stockings, are going about in fur coats. They don't have to depend on the lives of their husbands and sons, so let the war continue well. It is different for those whose families are in the east. They live in constant fear. Any day the postman can bring a letter with the note, "Fallen on the field of honor." One has to understand how to read between the lines of the army reports. We have been thrown back a long way. Streams of German blood apparently flow in front of Moscow. Look in this newspaper. Truly, what the young driver had told me was not exaggerated. Whole pages of death notices. Goebbels cannot hide this defeat from the people. The reports of the people on leave and the wounded about the retreat from Moscow reveal their lies. I can only tell you that the mood is rapidly sinking. Ever more of our citizens see the end of the war getting nearer. Even among the party members there are already some no longer talking about final victory. I don't believe that we can defeat the Russian colossus. Hitler has presumed to demand the whole of Europe. This can't lead to any good end. I sat on the bench and listened to the master joiner. He put down his plane from time to tap his pipe, to strop his file, or to relight his pipe with a wood splinter when it had already gone out. Old Hartmann was strongly religious. He regularly went to church and the Bible always lay near him in the workshop. The communists don't want to have anything to do with religions, he said, which is why I am against communism. I am really no friend of the Russians, but I am also no National Socialist. What one hears from the men on leave is shocking. Innocent people are murdered, civilians hanged. That I do not understand. And what is being done with the Jews is a disgrace. Why should they be weeded out? They too are people and do their duty like us. No, this is leading to no good ending. And the two-front war that we cannot maintain, as the First World War showed, Russia has vast areas and a big human reservoir at its disposal. We will soon make it. With these words I parted from my old acquaintance. But what I had heard from him gave fresh impetus to the doubts I had discussed with General Paulus a few weeks before, and robbed me of my sleep. Did other people at home think like the joiner? I listened around, spoke to farmers, small tradesmen, workers, and teachers. Most treated me with caution, avoiding my questions. For them I was a high-ranking officer. This immediately made them suspicious, and this did not help me share my thoughts. My wife also told me that people lived in constant fear of the Gestapo. A thoughtless word could lead to arrest and a concentration camp. Mistrust was distorting communal life. I experienced the same depressing atmosphere in a short visit to my brother in Aachen. Several of my young relatives had already fallen, farmers' sons who were supposed to take over the home farm. Earlier I had always liked going to my home village to see relatives and friends. This time I had to make condolence visits. Almost everywhere the women met me with crying faces. A call on General Keitel while on leave. Upon my return from Aachen, I found in Munzenberg a telegram from the city commandant in Frankfurt. On the orders of the 6th Army, break off your leave and report to the Army Personnel Office in Berlin next day. This was an unpleasant surprise. My wife was quite upset. She had so much enjoyed my leave. What plans we had made. Now everything had come to nothing. My bag was quickly packed. I found the parting very difficult. I caught a night train to Berlin in Bad Nauheim. Immediately upon arrival in the morning I reported to the personnel office. I was expected and immediately sent on by the duty officer in the courier train to Lützen. I had hardly time to say hello on the telephone to my brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Wagner, a departmental chief in the Wehrmacht High Command. Upon my arrival at Lützen the haste was explained to me. Here I learnt at last why my leave had to be curtailed. A flight to Poltava, where the head of the Army Personnel Office, General Keitel, had arranged a conference with the Army adjutants of Army Group South. I spent the night in Field Marshal von Brauchich's special train, which was camouflaged in a wood near Lützen. It consisted of several sleeping cars, a restaurant car and a saloon wagon set out with tables and chairs. The commander of this special train had assigned me a sleeping compartment and an orderly. As I climbed out of the vehicle at Lotsin Airfield, the special aircraft that was to fly General Keitel to Poltava was already waiting. He himself came shortly afterwards, accompanied by several heads of departments from the Army Personnel Office. I looked upon the flight with mixed feelings. A strong wind had blown up and my stomach had already gone on strike. We took our seats, the machine started up and soon the Lotsiner Lake lay before us. Already just a few hundred meters up, the aircraft was being strongly shaken by the storm. I had never been airsick before, but this time I was severely tested. My knees were still weak when we made an interim landing at Zhytomyr. Understandably, I had no wish to leave the machine. The flight on was pleasanter, but nevertheless I was pleased when I had firm ground beneath me once more at Poltava. The conference began the next day at the Army Group headquarters. In addition to Keitel and the departmental heads of the Army Personnel Office, taking part were the 1st Adjutant of Army Group South, Colonel von Wechmer, and the 1st Adjutants of the 2nd, 6th, 11th, and 17th Armies, as well as those of the 1st and 4th Panzer Armies. We were instructed to check over the staff of the commanding positions, to report those not fully qualified to the Personnel Office and to propose alternative employment for them. If possible, those affected would be replaced by other officers from the Army Group. Our 6th Army had proposed suitable lieutenants as battalion commanders and young but proven majors as regimental commanders. After 4 weeks they would be confirmed in their appointments and promoted to the next highest rank after a further 2 months. This proposal was approved. The Personnel Office recommended that the adjutants should deal in the same way with the loss of commanders as the 6th Army. I emphasized that from previous promotions not only the appointment of company and battalion commanders of the same rank should be encouraged, but also the ambitions of these officers. General Keitel then told us that before the beginning of an offensive, a leader reserve of officers of various ranks should be formed. By evening the conference came to an end. Subsequently I reported immediately to the Chief of Staff and General Paulus on the outcome. The following day saw me back at work. Leave was out of the question. A sergeant turns back a Soviet prisoner. A further crisis soon occurred at the breakthrough point south of Kharkov. The Red Army sought once more to breach our front. Their advance was checked only with difficulty by the commitment of 88mm flak units and a newly arrived division. The Soviets were able to take a number of prisoners from the 44th Division from Vienna. Among them was a sergeant platoon commander in an infantry regiment, whose name I have forgotten. To our astonishment, the division reported several days later that the captured sergeant had returned to his unit. The IC of this division added in his report that upon his return the soldier related that he had been well treated by the Red Army soldiers and officers. This was in contrast to our own propaganda news, and the IC had recorded the matter in harsh terms. I was against this when he introduced the case at the next conference with the Chief of Staff. He had already ordered the sergeant to Army headquarters escorted by an officer, as he thought that there was something strange about the case. In the interrogation by a staff officer from the IC department, the sergeant claimed that he had been able to escape. Nevertheless, he had been correctly handled as a prisoner, not only by the frontline troops, but also by the higher-ranking staff who had questioned him. He had been given food, drink and cigarettes. There was no mention of mishandling or a shot in the neck. This all seemed unbelievable. The IC was of the opinion that the sergeant had been sent back with the task of undermining the morale of his unit. Even if that was not the case, his retention would remain a danger to the troops' fighting morale. He therefore suggested that the sergeant should be transferred to a replacement unit with specific instructions not to be sent to the Eastern Front. This proposal was approved. These measures could not prevent the matter being widely discussed within the division. Most took the view that the prisoner had been sent back for a definite reason, which is why he had been so well handled. Only a few believed his report. What really happened is still unknown. This case also gave rise to discussion among the officers of the staff. Throughout, I took it as possible that this did not involve desertion, but I took to Paulus my thoughts on the sergeant's transfer to the replacement troops. By doing this, are we not organizing a negative discussion in the regiment or in the division? The sergeant had a good report from his company commander as an exemplary, dutiful, committed soldier who always led well. He had never been punished before, and enjoyed the respect of both his superiors and his inferiors. I believe that as soon as this unpleasant discussion is over, the subject will be avoided. Some of the soldiers will begin to doubt the veracity of our propaganda. Thoughtfully, the army commander explained, "Let us accept for once that the returned man had no special mission. Even then, his remaining with the troops brings a certain danger that he will have to speak and answer questions. So let the matter lie, and use the enemy propaganda." That is why I agree with our counter-espionage section's proposal. I also spoke to the officer who had conducted the interrogation and expressed my fears to him. He laughed. We recognized this danger too, which is why the section was informed as follows: "The examination by the army staff has proved that what the sergeant said was not the truth. He had been tasked by the Russians to persuade his comrades to desert." I was speechless. "Is that really true?" I asked him. "Naturally, not literally," replied the officer, "but I am of the opinion that in this way the discussion among the troops will be diminished." I was concerned about how this would all end. Doubtless there was some contradiction between our official propaganda and the truth. We all continually taught our soldiers that the Russians let no prisoners survive. It was declared and then spread. The sergeant spoke of German soldiers who had been prisoners since 1941 and said that they were well. What should one believe? The sergeant named the soldiers and their units that he had seen over there and spoken with. This information could be checked. A lie was easy to prove. But what were the Reds aiming at by sending back a platoon leader? What was his real task? That is how it goes when one's thoughts rumble on. There was another incident in our headquarters. Colonel von Bechtelsheim, the XXXTH Corps' chief of staff, was transferred as chief of staff to the First Army in France. His successor, Colonel Kinzel, formerly of the Foreign Army's East Section at Army High Command, reported to Paulus and joined us for lunch. During the conversation, Paulus announced his astonishment that the Army High Command, especially Hitler, had the impression that the Red Army had been destroyed. The activity of the Red Army since January, especially in front of Moscow and here with us, proves that this is debatable. What do you think, Kinzel? Hitler's revised thesis on the destruction of the Red Army was never acknowledged by my section. In my reports I have always indicated what lies before us, numerous confirmed reports from the Soviet Union that it is only just beginning to reveal its full military strength. They have established numerous new armies, their armaments industry is running and at even higher capacity. But Hitler does not want to know that, for it does not fit into his wishful dreams. He brushes our reports off the table with his hand. Truly, these were no grounds for comfort. What unforeseeable consequences would there be if the commander-in-chief set out on such a false appreciation of the enemy? But why do the generals at Army High Command and the Wehrmacht, why does the General Staff allow such false reports to circulate? It is absolute nonsense building the strategic and tactical direction of the war on such propaganda. Could such criminal recklessness really be possible? The question would not leave me alone. How bitterly I came to learn the truth, which had not occurred to me in my deepest dreams until now. Above all, I believed in Paulus. He would surely not let such an irresponsible underestimation of the enemy lull him into insecurity. He would follow his clear, sharp intellect. He had already displayed this in the few weeks since he took over command of the 6th Army. Rising doubts about one's superiors or comrades of equal rank seemed impossible to me and quite dangerous. I had already once known an officer whose straightforwardness had attracted me, the Army's new chief engineer, Colonel Sell, but we knew too little about each other, apart from that he was a holder of the Golden Badge of the Nazi Party. Despite several critical remarks that he had made, I took him as an unconditional follower of Hitler. Only during the course of time did I discover that Sell himself had many doubts and had had many serious disappointments with the way that Hitler was conducting the war. We became good friends. Propaganda leader Fritsch, the big summer offensive of 1941 lay before us. Major Menzel was sent as a liaison officer to the staff of the 6th Army from the Army High Command. Through his decisive reserve, he soon made quick contact with the headquarters and enjoyed general trust. Shortly before the operations began, we had another surprise. One of the senior men in the propaganda ministry, Herr Fritsch, was posted to our staff as a war correspondent. He reported to Paulus in the uniform of a specialist with the rank of captain. After our usual lunchtime walk, I sat next to Colonel Volter, our first staff officer, and during our conversation I asked him the question, why have they sent us one of Goebbels' closest staff? At the Army High Command and Wehrmacht High Command they are apparently expecting a change in the way the war is going. Our defeat at Moscow has strongly shaken confidence among the troops, and back at home and a victorious end of the war coming soon. The atmosphere has not only sunk in our army sector. The High Command want to revive it with special reports of victory on the Eastern Front. With the destruction of the Russian troops that broke through south of Kharkov, and especially with this year's summer offensive, we will provide material for new reports of victory. Goebbels' fellow worker, Fritsch, is tasked with writing special reports. As soon as he arrived, he wanted to know the names of the soldiers and young officers that distinguished themselves in the defensive fighting, but you know that yourself, ended the officer's explanation. As long as I am able, Volter, I will come often to you. That's fine. I am looking in the morning and evening reports for material that can be properly used for the press and radio. The first results of your work are already ready. In the Kiev Soldiers newspaper is one of your ever-repeated frontline experiences. It actually talks of making something out of everyday heroism. And what soldier would not be proud to see his name appear in the front newspaper? I am keen to know whether the war correspondent will be as active when the battle really begins. I have already asked the question. We shall see. One must incidentally accept that it will play a little to one side. As at present we have nothing more important to do, we shall send him to the divisions, where he will immediately be able to hear the sounds of battle. Hitler's attack aims for 1942, do you know, Volter? I don't envy you the double workload you have on your back, preparing the destruction of the enemy who have broken through our positions south of Kharkov, and with it the planning of the summer offensive. That is no piece of cake. The Army Group Adjutant told me that several newly formed divisions are already on their way from France. Hopefully we will not be obliged to deploy these divisions south and north of Kharkov as fire brigades. There have been indications of enemy activity at both those breaches. The commanding generals are very concerned and are urgently asking for reinforcements, as they are expecting a resumption of the enemy offensive. Order number 41 from the Wehrmacht High Command on the April 5, 1942 laid down the goals for Army Group South for the 1942 summer offensive. The whole operation would begin with an attack out of the area south of Orel towards Voronezh, to which the 2nd Army, the 4th Panzer Army and the 2nd Hungarian Army were allocated. Our 6th Army had the task of breaking through from the Kharkov area to the east and, in combination with the motorized units of the 4th Panzer Army thrusting towards the Donau, of destroying the enemy forces. Afterwards, in the third phase of the summer offensive, the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army would unite in the Stalingrad area with the forces thrusting eastwards from Taganrog-Artyomovsk. The city on the Volga would be reached, and this important